The rain fell in thick silver sheets over the city, washing away the bright lights of expensive buildings and turning every street into a mirror. Inside the towering mansion on the hill, 48-year-old millionaire Daniel Harrison stood by the enormous glass window of his office, holding a cup of black coffee. His company had made him one of the wealthiest men in the state, but wealth had brought him little peace. Since the death of his wife 5 years earlier, silence had become his closest companion. Every room in the mansion echoed with memories,
I can never thank you
every
enough for
success
this.
felt emptier than the
Don't
last.
settle for less.
Every morning followed the same routine.
Here's some warm
His
soup,
chauffeur
Mom.
arrived at exactly 7:30. His assistant prepared his schedule. His staff quietly cleaned the mansion before he returned late at night. Everything ran with perfect precision, yet Daniel barely noticed the people who kept his life in order. To him, employees were simply employees, professional, respectful, and invisible. One of those employees was a quiet maid named Grace. Grace had worked at the mansion for nearly 2 years. She always arrived before sunrise and left after sunset. She never complained, never asked for favors, and never spoke unless spoken to. Most of the staff admired her kindness. Whenever another employee was sick, Grace covered their duties without expecting extra pay. If the gardener forgot his lunch, Grace quietly shared hers. If the cook was overwhelmed, she stayed behind to wash dishes. Somehow she always smiled, even though her clothes were old and her shoes had clearly been repaired more than once. Daniel rarely noticed. To him, she was simply part of the background. That changed on one rainy evening. Daniel had returned home much earlier than usual after an important business meeting had been cancelled. The mansion was unusually quiet. As he walked toward his study, he glanced through the large kitchen window. Outside, near the servants' entrance, he saw Grace sitting alone on the back steps. The rain poured down only a few feet away. Wind carried cold droplets onto her shoulders. She held a small metal lunchbox on her lap. Inside was nothing more than a piece of dry bread and what looked like a boiled potato cut into tiny slices. She looked around carefully before eating, almost as if she didn't want anyone to see her. Daniel frowned. His mansion contained one of the largest kitchens he'd ever designed. There were warm dining areas for every employee. Why was she sitting outside? As he watched, something even stranger happened. A soaked stray dog slowly approached her. Instead of protecting her tiny meal, Grace smiled. "You're hungry too, aren't you?" she whispered. Without hesitation, she broke her bread in half and handed the larger piece to the trembling dog. The dog devoured it within seconds. Grace laughed softly despite having almost nothing left for herself. Daniel stared in disbelief. Most people with unlimited wealth hesitated before giving to others. This woman, who barely had enough food for herself, had willingly given away half. For reasons he couldn't explain, he couldn't stop watching. The next morning he called his house manager. "Who is the maid named Grace?" The manager looked surprised. "Sir. The quiet one." "Oh. Grace Williams. Tell me about her." The manager hesitated. "She's one of our hardest workers." "I didn't ask about work. Honestly, sir, we don't know much. She never talks about her personal life." Daniel nodded. "Find out." By afternoon the manager returned. "Sir, she lives on the east side of town. The poor district." "Yes. Family." "No husband. Children." "None that we know." Daniel leaned back. "Anything else?" The manager lowered his voice. "Sir, people say she walks almost an hour to work every day because she can't afford transportation." Daniel looked toward the window. An hour. In every kind of weather. For the first time in years, something disturbed his carefully ordered world. The following week he began noticing things he had ignored for years. Grace always arrived before everyone else. She quietly polished the marble floors until they reflected the chandeliers. She arranged fresh flowers exactly the way Daniel's late wife used to. She repaired torn curtains instead of replacing them to save the household money. When another maid accidentally broke an expensive vase, Grace accepted the blame so the younger employee wouldn't lose her job. Daniel watched all of this through security cameras and hallway mirrors. Why would someone sacrifice so much for strangers? One afternoon he decided to speak with her. "Grace." She immediately stopped working. "Yes, sir. You've been here 2 years." "Yes, sir. You've never asked for a raise." She smiled politely. "I'm grateful to have work. Don't you need more money?" Her answer caught him completely off guard. "There are people who need it more than I do." Daniel blinked. He had negotiated billion-dollar contracts. Yet those simple words stayed with him longer than any business meeting ever had. That evening, curiosity overcame him. Instead of heading to his office, he quietly instructed his driver to follow Grace after work, but from a distance. The luxury sedan slowly moved through neighborhoods Daniel had not visited in decades. The clean streets disappeared. Tall buildings became broken apartments. Streetlights flickered. Children played barefoot beside cracked sidewalks. Grace walked the entire way, carrying a worn cloth bag over her shoulder. After nearly 50 minutes, she stopped. Daniel expected her to enter a tiny apartment. Instead, she walked into an abandoned warehouse. Daniel frowned. What is she doing? He stepped out of the car and quietly followed. What he saw inside made his heart stop. Daniel's footsteps slowed as he approached the abandoned warehouse. The rusted metal door hung crooked on its hinges, and the building looked as though it had been forgotten years ago. Rainwater dripped steadily from the broken roof, and the wind whistled through shattered windows. Yet from inside came something unexpected, the soft sound of children laughing. He carefully peeked through a crack in the doorway. Grace was no longer the quiet maid from his mansion. She knelt on the dusty concrete floor surrounded by nearly 20 children of different ages. Their clothes were old, their shoes worn out, but every face lit up the moment they saw her. Miss Grace is here. One little girl shouted. The children rushed toward her, wrapping their arms around her waist. Grace laughed warmly and hugged each one as if they were her own family. Daniel couldn't believe what he was seeing. Grace opened the cloth bag she had carried all the way from the mansion. Inside were fresh vegetables, bread, fruit, rice, and several containers of leftover food. She had been saving food. Not for herself. For them. An elderly man with silver hair approached her. I'm sorry, he said quietly. We ran out of medicine for Tommy again. Grace reached into her pocket and handed him a small envelope. It's enough for this week's medicine. But Grace, that's your salary. She smiled. I'll manage. Daniel felt his chest tighten. That envelope likely contained money she desperately needed herself. Instead of spending it on rent, clothing, or transportation, she gave it away without hesitation. As dinner was prepared, Grace noticed one little boy sitting alone in a corner. His name was Noah. He looked no older than 7. She sat beside him. What's wrong? I wanted to save my food for my sister, he whispered. Grace gently stroked his hair. Then we'll make another plate together. She divided her own meal in half and placed it on his plate. Daniel looked away for a moment. He had attended charity galas worth millions of dollars. Cameras flashed as wealthy donors wrote enormous checks. Yet none of those moments felt as genuine as this simple act of kindness. After dinner, Grace gathered the children around. Instead of sending them to sleep immediately, she opened a worn storybook. Tonight, she said softly, we'll read about hope. The children listened with complete attention. Some rested their heads on her shoulders. Others quietly fell asleep while she read. Daniel noticed something strange. Every child called her the same thing. Mom Grace. His eyes widened. Not because she had adopted them. Because to children who had no parents, she had become one. The elderly caretaker finally noticed Daniel standing near the entrance. Can I help you? Grace turned around. The color drained from her face. Mr. Harrison. Embarrassment filled her eyes. I'm so sorry, sir. Daniel frowned. Sorry. For what? I didn't want anyone from work to know. Know what? She looked around at the sleeping children. This place. Daniel stepped inside. Who are they? Grace took a deep breath. Most of them lost their parents. She pointed toward one little girl. Her mother died from cancer. Another child. His parents abandoned him. A teenage boy. His father was killed in an accident. Daniel remained silent. Grace continued quietly. The city closed their shelter 2 years ago because of funding cuts. So they had nowhere to go. And you? I couldn't leave them. Daniel looked around the warehouse. The mattresses were patched together. Blankets had been sewn from old fabric. The shelves contained donated books. Everything had been repaired countless times. Everything had been built with love. You pay for this. Grace nodded. My salary. All of it. I keep enough for rent. Daniel was speechless. He had assumed she lived alone because she wanted privacy. Instead, she had chosen to dedicate her life to children who had absolutely no one. One little girl suddenly woke up. She rubbed her eyes before seeing Daniel. Are you one of Mom Grace's friends? Daniel hesitated. I suppose so. The little girl smiled. Then thank you. For what? For letting her work. Daniel's throat tightened. She tells us her boss is a good man. Grace quickly looked down. Daniel couldn't even remember the last time he had said more than a few words to her. Good man. He wasn't sure he deserved those words. As he prepared to leave, he noticed Grace carefully folding several blankets. They're not enough, she admitted softly. The roof leaks. It gets cold. But the children don't complain. Daniel silently walked back to his car. The drive home felt endless. For the first time in decades, the mansion seemed enormous. Every room, every chandelier, every painting, every luxury, suddenly felt painfully empty. Meanwhile, 20 children were trying to sleep beneath a leaking roof. Daniel stood in his late wife's old bedroom until sunrise. On the nightstand sat a framed photograph of her smiling. He remembered something she had once told him. Success isn't measured by what fills your house, but by whose lives you fill with hope. At the time, he had smiled politely and returned to work. Now those words echoed through his heart. The next morning, Daniel arrived at the office unusually early. His executives expected another discussion about profits and acquisitions. Instead, Daniel opened the meeting with a single sentence. I've spent my life building buildings. Everyone nodded. But I forgot to build lives. The room fell silent. No one knew that one rainy evening, and one humble maid, had just begun to change the heart of a millionaire forever. Daniel Harrison didn't sleep that night. The image of Grace sitting in the rain with nothing more than dry bread replayed in his mind over and over. Then came the memory of the warehouse, 20 children smiling despite having almost nothing, and Grace giving away every spare dollar she earned just to keep them alive. For years Daniel had believed success was measured by numbers. Bigger profits. Bigger homes. Bigger investments. But for the first time in his life, he realized the richest person he had ever met wasn't sitting in a corporate boardroom. She was the maid who quietly cleaned his floors every morning. The next day, Daniel arrived at the mansion before sunrise. As expected, Grace was already working. She was polishing the grand staircase when she noticed him. Good morning, Mr. Harrison. Grace, would you have breakfast with me? She looked completely shocked. Sir, with you? Yes. I don't think that's appropriate. I'm not asking as your employer. She hesitated. I'm asking as someone who wants to know the person who has been teaching me what kindness really looks like. For a moment, Grace didn't know what to say. She slowly nodded. Minutes later, they sat across from one another in the mansion's dining room. Grace had clearly never imagined sitting at the same table as the owner of the estate. Daniel noticed she barely touched her food. Is something wrong? She smiled gently. I'm just thinking about the children. He quietly pushed another basket of bread toward her. Take it. She looked up. For the warehouse. Tears instantly filled her eyes. You knew. I know everything now. Grace lowered her head. I'm sorry I never told you. You have nothing to apologize for. Daniel paused before asking the question that had haunted him all night. Why? Grace looked out the window. When I was 8 years old. I lived in a place just like that warehouse. Daniel remained silent. My parents died within months of each other. I had nowhere to go. She smiled sadly. There was one woman. An old schoolteacher. She wasn't rich. She couldn't adopt me. But every Friday she brought food. She read stories. She reminded us that someone still cared. Grace wiped away a tear. Before she passed away, she held my hand and said, if life ever blesses you, become the miracle someone else is praying for. Daniel felt tears forming in his own eyes. I never forgot. So when the shelter closed, I couldn't abandon them. Daniel whispered. You've spent your whole life keeping a promise. Grace nodded. Every single day. That afternoon, Daniel canceled every business meeting. Instead, he drove alone to the warehouse. The children immediately recognized him. It's the rich man. Noah ran toward him. Did Mom Grace get in trouble? Daniel knelt beside him. No. She's the bravest person I've ever met. The little boy smiled. I know. Daniel laughed through tears. He walked through every corner of the building. The leaking roof. Broken heaters. Cracked windows. Tiny mattresses. Yet somehow, there was more love inside those walls than he had ever felt inside his own mansion. Before leaving, Daniel quietly made a phone call. I want the best architects in the city. I need them immediately. Within days, construction crews arrived. Grace was horrified. What are you doing? Daniel smiled. Keeping a promise. What promise? The one-year-old teacher started. Over the next several months, the abandoned warehouse slowly disappeared. In its place rose a beautiful children's home. Bright classrooms. A library. A medical clinic. A warm dining hall. A safe playground. Every child would finally have a real bed. A real home. A real future. When the ribbon-cutting ceremony finally arrived, reporters filled the courtyard. Everyone expected Daniel Harrison to give a speech celebrating his generous donation. Instead, he stepped to the microphone and said, "Today isn't about me." He turned toward Grace. "It's about the woman who taught a millionaire what it truly means to be rich." The crowd erupted into applause. Grace stood frozen, tears streaming down her face. Daniel invited her onto the stage. "You spent years hiding your kindness because you never wanted recognition." She nodded. "But today, the world deserves to know your heart." Even the reporters wiped away tears. Daniel then announced something no one expected. "This home will forever be known as Grace House." The children screamed with joy. Little Noah hugged Grace as tightly as he could. "We'll always have a home now." Grace could no longer hold back her tears. She hugged every child one by one. Daniel watched quietly. For the first time since losing his wife, his heart felt full again. 6 months passed, and Grace House became a beacon of hope for the entire city. Children who once slept on cold concrete now woke up in warm bedrooms. They wore clean uniforms, attended school every day, ate healthy meals, and laughed without fear. Volunteers arrived from across the city, inspired by Grace's story. Doctors offered free checkups, teachers gave extra lessons, and local businesses donated supplies. Yet despite all the attention, Grace never changed. Every morning she still woke before sunrise. She still swept floors, cooked breakfast, tied children's shoelaces, bandaged scraped knees, and tucked them into bed every night. She never asked for praise. She simply loved them. Daniel visited almost every evening after work. The mansion no longer felt like home. Grace House did. One afternoon, Daniel found Noah sitting alone beneath a tree. "What are you thinking about?" Daniel asked. The little boy smiled. "I've never had a birthday party." Daniel paused. "Never." Noah shook his head. "I don't even know when my birthday is." Daniel's heart broke. That night, he gathered the staff. "If Noah doesn't know his birthday," he said, "then tomorrow will be his birthday." The next afternoon, the dining hall was filled with balloons, music, laughter, and a giant chocolate cake. When Noah walked in, everyone shouted, "Happy birthday!" The little boy froze. He looked around in disbelief. "For me." Grace nodded with tears in her eyes. "For you." Noah burst into tears and hugged Grace tightly. Then he hugged Daniel. No words were needed. For Daniel, it was worth more than every business award he had ever received. Weeks later, a reporter asked Daniel during an interview, "What inspired you to spend millions building Grace House?" Daniel smiled. "I didn't build it." The reporter looked confused. "I only paid for the bricks." He turned toward Grace, who was playing with the children nearby. "She built it with love long before I arrived." The interview spread across the country. Millions watched. People began donating to children's shelters, food banks, and orphanages. Thousands wrote letters saying Grace had inspired them to help someone in need. One woman's quiet kindness had created a wave of compassion that reached far beyond the city. One rainy evening, almost exactly 1 year after Daniel first saw Grace eating bread in the rain, they stood together on the porch of Grace House. Rain fell softly, just as it had that unforgettable night. Daniel handed Grace a small wooden box. "I have something for you." She opened it carefully. Inside was a tiny silver key. "What does it open?" she asked. Daniel smiled. "Come with me." They drove to a quiet neighborhood lined with trees. In front of a cozy little cottage covered with flowers, Daniel stopped the car. Grace looked at him, confused. "This house. It's yours." She stared at him in shock. "I can't accept this." "You can." "No, Daniel. You've spent your whole life giving other people a home. It's time someone gave one to you." Grace began to cry. She had rented tiny apartments all her life, never certain if she could afford the next month's rent. Now, for the first time, she had a place she could truly call home. She hugged Daniel tightly. "Thank you." Daniel smiled. "No, thank you." A few months later, Grace's house celebrated its first anniversary. Hundreds of guests attended. Former homeless children stood proudly on the stage, sharing their dreams. I want to be a doctor. I want to be a teacher. I want to become an engineer. I want to help children just like Grace helped me. Daniel sat in the front row, tears filling his eyes. Years earlier, he believed changing the world required billions of dollars. Now he understood something far more important. The world changes one act of kindness at a time. That evening, Grace stood before the children. Remember something, she said gently. Never think you're too poor to help someone. A smile costs nothing. A kind word costs nothing. A helping hand costs nothing. And sometimes, the smallest act of love becomes the greatest miracle in another person's life. The children applauded. Daniel did too. As the sun set, Noah ran over and took both Grace's and Daniel's hands. Are we a family now? Grace smiled through happy tears. Yes. Daniel squeezed Noah's hand. We always will be. The three of them walked back toward Grace's house together while dozens of children ran laughing across the playground. For the first time in many years, Daniel felt truly wealthy, not because of the money in his bank account, but because of the love in his heart. He finally understood that the richest people aren't those who own the most. They are the ones who give the most. Narrator's closing message. Sometimes, the greatest heroes wear no uniforms, hold no titles, and seek no recognition. They quietly change lives through simple acts of love and compassion. If this story touched your heart, remember to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another inspiring story. And always remember, kindness is the one treasure that grows richer every time you give it away.